The French Revolution was a period of great change in France. It began in 1789 and lasted for about 10 years. Before the Revolution, France was a powerful and wealthy country, but many of its people were deeply unhappy with their lives. The society was structured in a way that was very unfair to the majority of the population. A small number of people had all the power and wealth, while most people worked very hard but had very little. This inequality created a lot of tension and anger, which grew over many years. The people of France were tired of the old system and wanted something new. They dreamed of a country where everyone was treated with fairness and respect, and where they had a say in how their country was governed. This period of French history is not just a story about France. It is a story that affected the entire world. The ideas that came from the French Revolution, such as liberty, equality, and fraternity, spread far beyond the borders of France. They inspired people in other countries to question their own governments and to fight for their own rights. The revolution showed that ordinary people could come together to challenge the most powerful rulers and change the course of history. It was a time of great hope, but also a time of great violence and fear. Understanding the French Revolution helps us understand the development of modern democracy and the struggles for freedom that continue to this day. The journey into the revolution was not a sudden event. It was the result of long-term problems that the French monarchy failed to solve. Economic troubles were a major cause of the discontent. The country was deeply in debt, partly from expensive wars, including helping the American Revolution. The king's government spent more money than it collected in taxes. To solve this problem, the government wanted to raise taxes, but the burden of these taxes fell mostly on the poorest people. The clergy and the nobility, who were the richest groups, paid almost no taxes at all. This system was seen as profoundly unjust and was a source of constant frustration for the common people who struggled to feed their families. Furthermore, new ideas were spreading across France and Europe during this time, a period known as the Enlightenment. Thinkers and writers like Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Voltaire questioned the traditional authority of the king and the church. They argued that all men were born with natural rights and that governments should exist to protect those rights. These ideas were discussed in cafes, salons, and through pamphlets that were read by many people. They gave the French people a new language to express their unhappiness. They started to believe that a different kind of society was possible, one based on reason and justice rather than on tradition and privilege. This combination of economic hardship and revolutionary ideas created a perfect storm, setting the stage for the dramatic events that would soon unfold.
By the late 1780s, France was on the verge of bankruptcy. King Louis XVI's finance ministers had tried various reforms to fix the economy, but their efforts were consistently defeated by the powerful nobles and clergy who refused to be taxed. In a desperate move to find a solution, the king decided to call a meeting of the Estates General in May 1789. This was a very significant decision, because the Estates General, an assembly representing all three estates, had not met for 175 years. For the people of the Third Estate, this was a moment of great hope. They believed it was their chance to finally voice their grievances and demand serious reforms from the king. They wanted a fairer tax system and a greater say in the government. However, a major problem arose with how the Estates General was structured. Traditionally, each of the three estates met separately, and each estate had only one vote. This meant that the first and second estates, the clergy and the nobility, could always outvote the third estate 2-1. The representatives of the third estate, who represented the vast majority of the French population, knew that this system was unfair. They argued that voting should be done by head, meaning each representative should have one vote. Since the third estate had as many representatives as the other two estates combined, this would give them a much better chance of passing reforms. The king and the privileged estates refused to agree to this change. Frustrated by the deadlock, the representatives of the Third Estate took a bold and revolutionary step on June 20th, 1789. After finding themselves locked out of their usual meeting hall, they gathered at a nearby indoor tennis court. There, they took a famous oath known as the Tennis Court Oath. They swore not to leave until they had written a new constitution for France. By doing this, they were directly challenging the authority of the king. They declared themselves the National
Assembly, a new body that claimed to represent the French people. This was a pivotal moment. The Third Estate was no longer just asking for reforms, It was asserting its right to create a new government for the nation. The king was initially uncertain how to respond to this act of defiance. He ordered the other two estates to join the National Assembly, seemingly accepting the new reality. However, at the same time, he began to gather soldiers around Paris and Versailles. This made the people of Paris very nervous and suspicious. They feared that the king was planning to use military force to crush the National Assembly and end their hopes for reform. The atmosphere in the city grew tense, filled with rumors and fear. The political standoff had set the stage for a violent confrontation, and the people were ready to defend their new assembly and their dream of a fairer France. The spark of revolution had been lit, and it was about to burst into flames. As tensions mounted in Paris during the summer of 1789, the people became increasingly fearful of the king's troops. They needed weapons to defend themselves and the National Assembly. On the morning of July 14th, a large crowd of angry Parisians marched to the Bastille. The Bastille was a medieval fortress in the heart of Paris that was used as a state prison. Although it held only a few prisoners at the time, it was a powerful symbol of the king's absolute and often cruel power. For generations, it represented the tyranny of the Ancien Regime, a place where the king could imprison his enemies without a trial. The crowd believed that the fortress contained a large store of gunpowder and weapons that they desperately needed. The commander of the Bastille, the Marquis de Launay, refused to surrender the fortress and its ammunition to the crowd. As the day wore on, the angry mob grew larger and more impatient. Some people managed to climb the walls and lower the drawbridge, allowing the crowd to pour into the outer courtyard. The soldiers inside the Bastille became nervous and fired into the crowd, killing nearly 100 people. This enraged the attackers, who, with the help of some sympathetic soldiers who joined their cause, brought cannons to bear on the fortress walls. After several hours of fighting, the commander finally surrendered. The crowd stormed into the Bastille, freed the prisoners, and killed the commander and several of his soldiers. The fall of the Bastille was a huge symbolic victory for the revolution. It showed that the people of France were no longer afraid of the king's power and were willing to use violence to achieve their goals. The news spread quickly throughout France and the world. It was a clear sign that the king had lost control of his capital city. When Louis XVI was told what had happened, he supposedly asked, "Is it a revolt?" A duke standing nearby famously replied, "No, sire, it is not a revolt, it is a revolution." The event marked a point of no return. It saved the National Assembly from being crushed by the king's army and pushed the revolution forward with incredible momentum. In the aftermath of the attack, a new revolutionary government was formed in Paris, known as the Paris Commune. A new citizens' militia, the National Guard, was created to keep order and defend the revolution, with the Marquis de Lafayette, a hero of the American Revolution, as its commander. In the countryside, news of the Bastille's fall sparked a wave of panic and rebellion known as the Great Fear. Peasants, fearing that nobles were sending armies to crush them, rose up against their lords. They attacked castles, burned documents that recorded their feudal obligations, and asserted their freedom. The storming of the Bastille was not just an attack on a building, it was an attack on the very idea of absolute monarchy and feudal privilege. Following the dramatic events of the summer of 1789, the National Assembly set out to create a formal statement of its principles. Inspired by the American Declaration of Independence and the ideas of Enlightenment philosophers, the Assembly drafted a groundbreaking document. On August 26, 1789, it issued the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. This declaration was a clear and powerful statement of the core values of the French Revolution. It proclaimed that all men were born and remain free and equal in rights. These rights included liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression. It was, a radical departure from the old system, where a person's rights and status were determined by their birth into a particular social estate. The declaration laid out a vision for a new French society. It stated that the law should be the expression of the general will, and that all citizens had the right to participate in its formation, either personally or through their representatives. It called for an end to arbitrary arrest and punishments, guaranteeing that every person was innocent until proven guilty. The document also established freedom of speech and freedom of the press, allowing people to express their ideas without fear of censorship. Furthermore, it declared that taxes should be paid by all citizens according to their ability to pay, directly attacking the tax privileges of the first and second estates. It was honestly a blueprint for a modern, democratic nation-state. However, the promises of the declaration were not extended to everyone. The document spoke of the rights of man, but it did not include women. Olympe de Gouges, a writer and activist, pointed this out by publishing her own Declaration of the Rights of Woman and the Female Citizen in 1791, but her ideas were largely ignored by the male revolutionaries. The rights in the declaration also did not initially apply to the enslaved people in France's colonies. Despite its limitations, the document was incredibly influential. It dismantled the ideological foundation of the Ancien Régime by asserting that sovereignty resided not in the king, but in the nation as a whole. Power, it argued, should come from the people. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen quickly became one of the most important documents in modern history. Its principles of liberty, equality, and fraternity became the slogan of the revolution and inspired countless movements for freedom and democracy around the world. It provided a universal language of human rights that people could use to challenge injustice and tyranny everywhere. Although King Louis XVI was reluctant to accept the declaration, the political tide had turned against him. The ideas enshrined in this document would guide the revolution through its next phases and would continue to shape political thought for centuries to come, long after the revolution itself had ended. Despite the sweeping changes and the new constitution that created a constitutional monarchy, King Louis XVI was never truly comfortable with his reduced role. He was a man who believed in his divine right to rule, and he found it, incredibly difficult to share power with the National Assembly. In June of 1791, the king and his family, including Queen Marie Antoinette, attempted to flee France. They disguised themselves and traveled in a carriage towards the Austrian border, where they hoped to rally support from other European monarchs and launch a counter-revolution to restore the old order. However, they were recognized in the small town of Varennes and were captured. The royal family was escorted back to Paris under guard, surrounded by silent, angry crowds. The king's attempt to flee was a disaster for the monarchy. It shattered any remaining trust the people had in him. To many, it was clear proof that he was a traitor who was conspiring with foreign enemies against his own country. The failed escape radicalized the revolution, strengthening the position of those who wanted to abolish the monarchy altogether and establish a republic. Calls for the king's removal grew louder. The situation became even more tense when other European powers like Austria and Prussia became alarmed by the events in France. They issued declarations threatening to intervene to protect the French monarchy, which only made the French revolutionaries more defiant and nationalistic. In April 1792, France declared war on Austria, beginning a series of conflicts that would engulf Europe for more than 2 decades. The war went badly for France at first, and the revolutionaries blamed the king and queen, suspecting them of secretly helping the enemy. In August 1792, a radical mob, backed by the revolutionary government of Paris, stormed the Tuileries Palace where the royal family was living. The king's Swiss guards were massacred, and the royal family was forced to take refuge with the Legislative Assembly. The mob's action effectively ended the monarchy. The Assembly suspended the king's powers and voted to imprison him and his family. A new, more radical governing body, the National Convention, was elected to decide the future of France. The National Convention's first major act, in September 1792, was to formally abolish the monarchy and declare France a republic. The next question was what to do with the former king, now known simply as Citizen Louis Capet. He was put on trial for treason. The evidence against him, including his attempt to flee and his secret correspondence with foreign powers, was overwhelming. After a heated debate, the convention found him guilty. On January 21, 1793, Louis XVI was executed by the guillotine in a public square in Paris. His execution was a shocking event that sent waves across Europe. It symbolized a complete and irreversible break with the past. The ancient monarchy was dead, and the new republic now had to face a future filled with uncertainty, war, and internal conflict. After the execution of King Louis XVI, the French Republic found itself in a desperate situation. It was at war with most of Europe, and there were rebellions against the revolution happening within France itself. Food shortages and rising prices caused widespread unrest in the cities. In response to this crisis, the National Convention gave immense power to a small group of its members called the Committee of Public Safety. This committee, led by a powerful and determined lawyer named Maximilien Robespierre, became the de facto government of France. Robespierre and his allies believed that to save the revolution, they had to be ruthless with its enemies. This marked the beginning of the most radical and violent phase of the revolution, the Reign of Terror. Robespierre was a devoted revolutionary who believed in creating a republic of virtue. He wanted to build a new society based on reason, patriotism, and civic duty. However, he believed that this new republic could only be achieved by eliminating all those who opposed it. The Committee of Public Safety passed a law called the Law of Suspects, which allowed for the arrest of anyone who was considered an enemy of the revolution. This could include nobles, priests, and anyone who criticized the government. Revolutionary tribunals were set up to try these suspects. The trials were often very quick, with little chance for the accused to defend themselves. The guillotine, a machine designed for quick and supposedly humane beheadings, became the terrifying symbol of this period. During the Reign of Terror, which lasted from September 1793 to July 1794, thousands of people were arrested and executed. It is estimated that around 17,000 people were officially executed by the guillotine, and about 10,000 more died in prison or were killed without a trial. The terror was not just directed at former nobles and clergy. It soon turned on anyone who was seen as a threat, including fellow revolutionaries who were considered not radical enough. Famous figures like Queen Marie Antoinette were executed, but so were many ordinary people, farmers, shopkeepers, and workers, who were accused of hoarding food or speaking out against the government. The atmosphere in France became one of extreme paranoia and fear, where a person could be denounced by a neighbor and sent to the guillotine. Eventually, the violence became too much even for the revolutionaries themselves. Robespierre became increasingly powerful and dictatorial, executing many of his former allies and colleagues. Other members of the National Convention began to fear that they would be his next victims. In July 1794, a group of his opponents organized against him. They arrested Robespierre and his closest followers. The very next day, the man who had led the terror was himself executed by the guillotine, without a trial. The death of Robespierre marked the end of the Reign of Terror. While the terror had succeeded in controlling internal dissent and mobilizing the country for war, its extreme brutality had turned many people against the radical phase of the revolution. The French Revolution brought profound and dramatic changes to the everyday lives of ordinary people. One of the most significant changes was the complete dismantling of the old social structure. The privileges of the nobility and the clergy were abolished. The complex system of feudal dues that peasants owed to their lords was eliminated, freeing farmers from centuries of financial obligation. The revolution promoted the idea that all citizens were equal before the law, regardless of their birth. This was a monumental shift. A talented person from a humble background now had opportunities to rise in society, in the army, or in government, in a way that would have been impossible under the Ancien regime. This new sense of equality was a powerful force that reshaped French society. The revolution also tried to change culture and daily life in very direct ways. The government promoted a new sense of national identity and patriotism. People began to address each other as citizen and citizeness instead of using formal titles like monsieur and madame. Revolutionary festivals were organized to celebrate the Republic and its values. Even time itself was changed. The government introduced a new revolutionary calendar, with 12 months named after the seasons and divided into 3 10-day weeks. The year 1792, when the Republic was founded, was declared Year 1. This was part of an effort to de-Christianize society and break from all traditions of the old order, replacing religious holidays with secular celebrations. The Catholic Church, which had been so powerful before 1789, saw its influence drastically reduced. The National Assembly seized the church's vast lands and sold them to raise money for the state. A law called the Civil Constitution of the Clergy required priests to swear an oath of loyalty to the state, turning them into government employees. Many priests refused. creating a deep division within the country between those who supported the revolutionary church and those who remained loyal to the Pope in Rome. During the most radical phase of the revolution, the Reign of Terror, a campaign of de-Christianization saw churches closed, religious symbols destroyed, and a new cult of the Supreme Being promoted by Robespierre as a replacement for Christianity. However, for many ordinary people, the revolution also brought great hardship. The constant warfare, political instability, and economic disruption made life difficult. The price of food, especially bread, remained a major problem, leading to riots and unrest. The introduction of a new paper currency, the assignat, led to massive inflation, making people's savings worthless. While the revolution brought new rights and opportunities for some, for others it brought uncertainty, violence, and economic suffering. The changes were not always welcomed, and many people, particularly in the countryside, remained deeply attached to their traditional way of life and their Catholic faith. The revolution transformed France, but the experience of that transformation varied greatly from person to person. The French Revolution did not end with the fall of Robespierre. The period that followed, known as the Thermidorian reaction, saw a move away from radicalism towards a more conservative republic. However, the government remained unstable and corrupt. In 1799, a brilliant and ambitious young general named Napoleon Bonaparte seized power in a coup d'état. He would eventually crown himself Emperor of the French, seemingly ending the republic that the revolution had fought to create. While Napoleon's rise might appear to be a reversal of the revolution, he actually preserved many of its key changes. He created a unified legal system, the Napoleonic Code, which was based on principles of equality before the law and was adopted in many other countries. He also centralized the government and created a more efficient state. The most important legacy of the French Revolution lies in its powerful ideas. The principles of liberty, equality, and fraternity spread across Europe and the globe. The revolution showed that an old, established order could be overthrown by its people. It inspired nationalist movements in Italy, Germany, and Poland, and it fueled struggles for democracy and social reform throughout the 19th century. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen became a model for constitutions and human rights declarations around the world. It established the modern political concepts of the nation-state, popular sovereignty, and human rights as the basis for legitimate government. The revolution permanently changed the way people thought about society and politics. The revolution also served as a powerful and sometimes cautionary example. The violence of the Reign of Terror showed the dangers of radicalism and how the pursuit of a perfect society could lead to tyranny and bloodshed. This has been a lesson studied by politicians and revolutionaries ever since. The struggle between the moderate and radical phases of the revolution highlights the enduring challenge of how to achieve fundamental change without descending into chaos and violence. The French Revolution was a complex and multifaceted event, full of contradictions, a fight for liberty that led to a dictatorship, a quest for equality that descended into terror, and a dream of fraternity that resulted in years of devastating war. In conclusion, the French Revolution was unquestionably a major turning point in world history. It brought an end to the Ancien Régime in France and destroyed the feudal system that had dominated Europe for centuries. It unleashed powerful political and social forces that reshaped France and had a profound and lasting impact on the rest of the world. While the path it took was often brutal and chaotic, the ideals it championed, that all people have rights, that they should be equal under the law, and that the government should represent the will of the people, have become fundamental pillars of modern democratic societies. The world we live in today, with its emphasis on democracy, human rights, and nationalism, was deeply and irreversibly shaped by the momentous events that began in France in 1789.